I was trying the same thing to avoid root canal treatment, but it didn't seem to work.
Okay.
Oh, I've got to
But,
get my wisdom teeth out. So yeah.
but apparently, Rose, of course, will changed her consciousness because all the leg pain and all that she was having. She said, "I just did what Mike, talked about, and I'm absolutely pain free."
Oh, awesome. Excellent. Well, it is learning, to think a different way, to be wired a different way, to not operate out of the thinking that we've had before in our past. But it does take some, practice, when you begin to choose a different way of viewing, so long as it's aligned out of the heart of God, then that's the starting point to make sure that we're not just coming up with wishful thinking, good ideas. It's got to flow out of the heart of God. But I do believe that as we learn more, and our mind gets thinking. I was watching a film last night called Arrival, in which it was a sci-fi film, but it was about communication, really. And the whole film was about communication. And this lady was trying to communicate with beings who didn't actually communicate in spoken language. So she was trying to use words, concepts, but eventually found that these people, their language and the way they thought was non-linear. So time didn't work for them like it did for them. And as she was focusing on this language, learning to learn it, her mind started to be rewired. So she started thinking non-linearly and actually was drawing from a different way of engaging. It was quite an interesting film how they use that concept. But I think it's very much the same with us and God. If we spend enough time outside of time and space within God's heart, his mind, then you begin to become affected by that, and even the way our thinking becomes changed. I think being renewed or having a renewal of our minds, I go back to our old way of doing it, or my old way of doing it would be get some scriptures and put them up around the house and confess them and keep thinking about them and try and believe them, and God honored that to a degree. I mean, I think it did, in a sense. It's living. The word of God is living and alive, and it does have effective power in itself. But it was almost a methodology of trying to get a scripture, and so that scripture would actually become true by trying to believe it, rather than actually it's already true. I just have to accept it, which is a different way of engaging it. And the more you engage in God and you realize, the whole thing of Ephesians 1:4, that it's already his idea, that he's already included us in blameless innocence before the foundation of the world, then you begin to see yourself from that perspective, and then you think from that perspective, and then you begin to act from that perspective. And I think the danger is obviously trying to jump in at the end and act from that perspective without having first engaged that perspective and begun to have your mind renewed to that perspective, because then you try and do it without having the framework behind it, that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. It's like we try and do the so is he bit without having necessarily got the thinking in our heart bit. And I would have thought, for me, that's what I did in the past. I thought, well, this is how it should be, so I'll try and be like that. And my mind wasn't renewed, and I didn't think that way. And I remember the first time, I suppose, this really changed how I began to live was when I was looking at healing and needing to be healed of a situation. And it took me several years to get to the point where I wasn't focusing on the situation, but just on knowing that God was my healer. But I didn't know how to do it. and I just sort of stumbled by engaging with all the scriptures, and eventually I thought that way, you know, and I was trying to think healing when I needed to be thinking healer. And as I discovered that God was my healer, then the focus wasn't on the healing, it was on God, and therefore the healing came as a result of I believed he was my healer, rather than I'm focusing on I need to be healed, I need to be healed. And I know that changed my whole thinking, and I guess my perspective to do with faith. But the process of being able to perceive something, create the reality from what we perceive, is one that I believe that we will learn more and more to be able to do. But it all comes out of relationship. Otherwise it becomes a formula, and formulas don't last long, if at all. You know, but interesting. But it's great, you know, just for just to say, okay, I'm creating the reality that I'm pain freer than I am. I mean, that's just great, isn't it? Yeah. But sometimes it is as simple as just, that's it. Hey, this is the right way to think. I'll think that way, and it responds, you know, and it happens, you know, which is always an encouragement. It's not so much of encouragement for those who tried and didn't, it wasn't as easy as that for them. Because they're like, well, how did you manage to do it? And I've been trying for years to try and get this to work, and you just thought and it worked, you know. But I think that's the thing. Trying to do something is very different from just it working out of the relational. You know, but all good though. So yeah. Okay. Okay, so anyone got anything they want to bring up?
I do, Mike. We've been talking a lot about our mindset and the mind of Christ. And I remember when you were here, and even last week, we talked about even our mindset for sin. We went off on that. My mindset was wrong on that. Another mindset I have is worship.
Yeah.
And, you know, I go back to what John 4:24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. And I'm wondering, what does that mean? Because it must worship him. It's very important worship. But am I even worshiping him?
Well, again, you know, is our concept of worship tends to be focused around singing, and our act of worship, in the sense of, you know, where we worship God by singing to him and adoring him and that type of thing, because we focused on worship services and worship times and worship bands. And I think, to be honest, that is really a misnomer. In the true worship is just obeisance. It is the act of bowing before the king and acknowledging kingship. And I guess you could say humbling yourself under the mighty hand of God so he can exalt you would be true worship. And again, if you think of Romans 12 about the renewing of our mind, it is, you know, one of the things says, you know, a spiritual act or service of worship. They're all the same word, and it's service, worship comes down to me agreeing with God about my destiny and outworking it. That's true worship. I can say everything with words, and I can sing lovely songs, and I can bow down on the floor and lay before God and get up and do my own thing, you know, which true worship is actually being in relationship with God and outworking my destiny, all those good works that he's prepared for me in that relationship. That's what true worship is, you know. And when we one of our 9 spirit gates is the worship gate, you know. And I think people tend to think, well, that's the bit that enables me to sing to God, you know, where actually that's the bit where I come into agreement with God. I worship. I come into that place of obeisance, recognizing that he's God. And then in my soul, then the key gate in my soul then is choice. Because you can have all the other things, but you can have all the other gates. You can have your emotions and your will, and you can have your mind and reason and conscience and imagination all lined up with the worship of God's purpose and plan for our lives, and then choose not to, you know. And I think Jesus gave a couple of illustrations of those that said, I'll do it, and then didn't, or those who said, I won't do it, and did. And actually, it was the ones who said, I won't do it, but did, were the ones who were truly worshiping, if effectively, you know, because they actually come into agreement with God. So true worship is really absolutely nothing to do with worship services, singing, or anything like that. The heart of true worship is relational, walking together like the Father did with Adam and Eve in the garden. That's true worship. So their tending and cultivating the garden was true worship, out of the fact that they walked with God and outworked his heart, which was their heart. So yeah, I think our worship services will change a lot when we know what true worship is, because we will just be engaging. I mean, I long for the time when our engagements, when we come together corporately, are not just singing songs to God, but are engaging the presence of God in such a way that we all begin to outwork the presence of God, whatever way that is. And that might be engaging in the room, it might be engaging in time and space, it might be engaging another part of the world, being translated in the spirit, because I'm touched the heart of God, and the heart of God is released me to fulfill that today as part of my destiny, which will be an exciting thing to come together and all engage around the presence of God and around the ark of his presence, and all end up being wherever that takes you. And that might be together, it might be individually, but it will be a very different dynamic than the sort of, you know, 3 fast songs, couple of slow songs, and then the word, you know, which is, you know, the sort of general sort of way. Now, and others are very focused on, well, we'll give as much time to the singing part, and that's the most important part. And other people will be, well, actually, no, we'll give the time to the word, and that's the important part. And I think it all comes down to essentially relationship again. Yeah, and I do love singing. I mean, I've got nothing against singing. You know, I love singing. I love expressing my heart towards God in adoration and praise and thanksgiving, and all that's part of it. It just isn't worship, you know. You know, it's praise, thanksgiving, and adoration, which is we lump it all together and call it worship, and it really isn't worship.
So when David was dancing around before the Lord, worshiping him, it wasn't. So we mistakenly taken that meaning worship, and it was really in his spirit. He was worship. He was in alignment with God, with what God wanted at the time.
Well,
because that's usually where they take it from. While David danced before the Lord, he worshiped the Lord. Let's all do that now together.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. David was coming out of a place of knowing the heart of God in ways that most people didn't, you know. Therefore, I think it was an abandonment to God, and in a sense, it wasn't a corporate act, because he didn't care what anyone else was thinking. It wasn't something that he was doing together with others. He was just abandoned with absolute joy in that the ark of the presence of God was coming back into their midst. So he was overjoyed at God's presence and expressed it to him in abandonment. Now, we tend to focus on, well, he danced, but it was the abandonment of himself to the presence of God, I think, which was really what it was about. And ultimately that when would outwork flowing out of that presence of God would actually come all the things which fulfill our destiny and the purposes of God. You know, because it's not an awful lot of point singing lovely songs to God and then not outworking anything that fulfills the kingdom and brings the kingdom on earth as is in heaven, you know. But we've sort of created a whole dynamic, which, you know, worshiping in spirit and in truth, well, that is a description of me and him being in relationship, you know, because he's the truth. And when my spirit is engaged with the truth, I'm free to be me in that relationship. And so I would say it's the freedom for me to be me in relationship with God and be the person that God has created me to be and flow from that place. Yeah, which is a spiritual activity. I mean, it's not just a fleshly one, although our bodies can be involved in it. But, you know, every day, I mean, my desire is to see him on the throne of my life, which to me is an act of worship. It's an act of obedience. It's saying, hey, you're my dad and I want you to father me. You know, it's very much in the relationship that all that works. But I think we've made it something that it probably isn't, and called it something that it probably isn't. You know, there was a song we used to sing, you know, I'm coming back to the heart of worship. It's not the thing that I've made it, type of thing, you know. And I think there's something about that the real heart of worship is relationship, and what flows out of that relationship.
It always seems to me that often in worship was very soulless. And if you had a good worship band, it had good worship. And if they're off key, that wasn't good worship. And it was the worship band to bring you in to worship.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's anything to do with worship as the meaning of the word. I think it does have to do with praise and adoration and thanksgiving and celebration. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. It just isn't worship as what the word really means. You know, it's how we have defined the word from a perspective of those other things: celebration, you know, of praise, adoration. You know, because I can say I adore God and be moved emotionally and then still not do anything that outworks who I am, you know, which is, for me, that's irrelevant. You know, saying words, you know, really doesn't really cut it when it comes to, you know, the outworking of my identity in him. You know, it just doesn't really flow out of just saying words. If the words are a representation of what's in my heart and I outwork those words, that's great. But words themselves are pretty much meaningless when they're expressed, you know, with everybody else, and you get caught up in the emotion of everything. I mean, you know, it is one of those things which I think we have potentially have a formula which most sort of charismatic like churches would follow. You know, there's a band, it's playing sort of up-tempo modern music and sometimes quieter stuff. It gets your emotions and excitement going, which I don't think there's anything wrong in that per se. I just don't think it really is what, when we talk about worship and our, you know, our act of worship, you know, outworking the will of God. I think Romans 12:1 and 2 sort of express it there. What is the perfect will of God? Well, me to be me in relationship with him, fulfilling my destiny. I mean, that's what true worship is. But you know, the actual, what we call worship services are more a production of our needing to do something when we come together. Yeah.
And it often seemed to me that worship, and I often what I observed was worship worked up the emotion, which then led to the offering. You know, it was almost like
that's not a cynical view, Bill, is it? I mean, really not a cynical view.
In most every church I was ever at, but it became very emotional. Yeah. And I don't know. And if anything, I think you want to try to tone down the emotions, I think. If you're going to worship God, am I wrong there?
Well, there's nothing wrong in engaging God in the fullness of our being. You know, I just wouldn't call it worship. You know, I just don't think what we do in a meeting is worship. I think it can be celebration, praise, thanksgiving, adoration, expressions of our hearts towards God, and I don't think any of that is wrong at all. I just don't think you can do all that and still not worship God, because you can go away from that amazing experience and effectively do your own thing the next day, or even the rest of that day. You know, so if it isn't if it is not coming into an acceptance of who God is and therefore surrendering to him, then it isn't really what worship is. If any of those things helps us get to that point of surrendering to him, that's all good. But there's nothing wrong in expressing emotions. There's nothing wrong in being excited, being passionate. You know, I think that's all great. And I don't see any problem with any of that, as long as you don't think that's it. You know, that isn't what real worship is. Real worship is, am I going to outwork this relationship I have with God on a day-to-day basis to fulfill my destiny in furthering, bringing glory to him? I mean, that's ultimately how I would see what I would want to live like. Sometimes engaging corporately together can help that. Sometimes it can be manipulative and hype, you know, and sometimes you see the hypey things of someone trying to drum it up somewhat, and you know, hey, let's give God a clap, or well, if person didn't want to clap God before, what was the point of clapping someone when they've just been told to? I mean, it doesn't really, it's just a person trying to effectively get you to do something that they think is a good idea, which to me is not a good thing. You know, worship leading and that type of thing, you know, I'm not into that. You know, it's better that we are looking to engage together and just flow together. So if there are musicians, that the musicians and people are just together flowing, so that it's not a us and them, or they're facilitating us. It's actually, no, we're coming together to express our praise, celebration, thanksgiving to God in different ways, which may reflect on our body position of our hands raised or our arms wide, which is all part of expression, but it's only expressing an outflowing of what's in the heart. If it's just formulaic, or everyone's got their hands up, I better put my hands up, then all it's being is trying to conform to others to fit in, which does go on when you get people together corporately. You know, when people are secure in their relationship with God, and then they know who they are, they know who he is, then coming together corporately gives us a way of just engaging that together and fellowshipping together in it and being together in it, which I like. I know, I gotta be honest, I like corporately singing together, but I'm aware that is not what worship is, you know. But in terms of the offering, all those things, anything can be manipulated. You know, anyone's emotions can be manipulated. You know, it doesn't take a lot to manipulate someone's emotions. I mean, and music is a very powerful tool for that. That's why people buy music. That's why nostalgia is quite a strong thing that comes through remembering music of our past. And, you know, it is a very evocative thing that can be very positive, but can also be manipulative. You know, and I've seen people who try to fit in. Everyone's having a party and they don't really feel like it, but they try and fit in, you know. So, and they're miserable on the inside, but they're kicking their legs in the air, and you know, they're going through the motions because everyone else is. And that's not reality. It'd be better if they just lay on their face and cried out to God, you know, because that it actually is more of an expression of where they are, and God loves reality. There's also the dynamic of, well, we give a sacrifice of praise. You know, actually sometimes, hey, God's worth it even when we don't feel it. And it's a good thing to, hey, acknowledge God. Like when you read the Psalms, that's what David did time and time again. It's like he has a bit of a moan and a rant in the first part of the psalm, and then at the end it's like, oh well, I praise you anyway, you know, because he recognized that God is worthy of praise even if he's going through a hard time, you know. And there is something about that which does, God honors that willingness to sacrifice, and sometimes he engages us in it. But I think if we make anything formulaic, then it becomes ritualistic and there's no life in it. So it really is looking to flow with God and the presence of the Holy Spirit and the angelic realm and whatever. You know, I mean, we had an interesting time yesterday in that, you know, it's August, people are away on holiday and different type of things. And some of our usual musicians weren't there. So we had sort of more of an unplugged set. But actually, because it was somewhat quieter and we didn't have drums, you actually heard what was going on. And people, there were angelic voices, there were waves of sound that were filling the room, which weren't coming from the people, but people did actually express something, and you sensed it, because there was a different dynamic. You know, it was great. You know, I really enjoyed it. And I was aware much more of people's involvement because they weren't dependent on, hey, we've got a drummer and we've got the full band and hey, everything's being driven along. You know, now that's good sometimes. And yesterday was a different way of engaging, which seemed to give people the space to just begin to express from their spirit, whether it be a sound or a song or singing in tongues or just being there. It was different. So yeah, all these things are quite interesting when we're looking at it from a new perspective, a new versus old perspective. What does it look like? You know, I think most of it comes down to the motive of the heart. You can do something which looks very similar to something that other people do, but the motive of the heart and what's in it is very different. And I think we've got to be careful that we just don't look at the surface or the book, judge the book by its cover, and realize that on the surface, people might look at our meetings and think, well, they're quite traditional, really, from a charismatic perspective, not realizing that what's going on behind comes from a different framework, in terms that we're opening portals, we're inviting the angelic presence, that we're cooperating with and preparing and calling and engaging in heaven and bringing things from heaven into the earth. All that people might not be aware of if they're just looking up, well, they sing some songs and, you know, occasionally someone says something or whatever, not realizing that several people may not even be in the room spiritually. They may be somewhere else because they've learned to tune into what God is doing and be available. So, you know, what we do, we also respect some of the people who are there, who are people who aren't yet believers, and there are people from our rehabilitation unit. And so, you know, to say, hey, today we're just going to come into the room, engage heaven, all get assignments from heaven and all have a great time, is great for those who can do it. But for those who would have no clue of how to do that, they would be sat there or stood there like spare parts. So we're trying to teach, train, equip people to be able to engage with God themselves, which may well open up all sorts of avenues and opportunities of them being in the presence of God in their realms of heaven, engaging heaven, being translated, relocated, all sorts of different things. But as they flow with it, rather than it being led and from the front. So we don't tend to have anybody really saying, we need to do this or going to do that. Occasionally someone might say, oh, I feel, you know, there's this angel here who wants to do something. But generally we're looking to help people engage themselves, and not really be dependent on the Holy Spirit to give all the gifts, because we want to mature beyond just reliant on the Holy Spirit to be able to engage our spirit with God and then coming out of that flow of relationship. But, yeah.
But the music does get you on a frequency sometimes, though, and does put your focus on God in the services. I think sometimes that's why churches do it.
Yeah, I mean, music. God has given music. He's given sound. He's given rhythm. He's given all those things. They're all created by him, and they can be very helpful, you know, in the right time, in the right place. And I'm not against that. I love music. I love sounds and frequencies, and, you know, being open to what they do. And we have, you know, flags and banners, and those also movement of colors opens things and does all sorts of things, you know. But what happens, you know, all that is to help us engage with God, and therefore come into a deeper intimacy with him in that. I think sometimes it can be in a very emotional thing that ends up just stirring people's emotions, and they just end up crying because their emotions are stirred. They don't even know why they're crying. You know, it would be, for me, it's rather, although, you know, at times my emotions do get stirred, I want to engage God. That's the key in all of it. I want to come into a deeper connection with God, and if that can happen corporately when we sing, that's great. You know, because we also know, like, David played music and Saul was Saul. You know, when Saul engaged the music, it brought down the whole deliverance thing, and, you know, it's quieting down what was going on within him. But some of it, I think we just must make sure it's just living and active and flowing out of God, rather than becoming formulaic. And is always a temptation to try and make everything a simple formula that then everyone can just work with. And I think that oversimplifies it in a way. I mean, I use music and background music, obviously, with activations and things like that, simply because it's helpful sometimes. I don't use them myself when I engage God. I don't need that. Others find it helpful, you know. And I think there's always a thing, you know. I think if we learn to tune into the frequencies of what's going on, then sounds, rhythms go beyond just music and singing songs. There are healing frequencies. There are things where we can begin to resonate with the love of God and come into harmony with him. And a lot of those things are musical terms, but I don't think are really talking about music per se, but more about our interaction with the presence of God. And I love the sort of the healing things. And, you know, when I was, you know, I had my healing bowl thing and a crystal bowl thing that I was given in Seattle. I've been learning to play that, and, you know, I have sounds and frequencies and different things, and they are quite interesting. You know, when you start to engage your spirit with the sound, you know, it really does just begin to touch and vibrate and open things and do things, you know. And I mean, I've been, you know, I think the intent of the musician and the intent of the worshiper or the person who's engaging is also part of it, because I think something flows through a person. Was it just that David was just, you know, chinging away on a harp or something, or was he carrying something creative that he was releasing when he was engaging, you know? So, you know, let me get my bowl thing. This sort of crystal bowl thing is, you know, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I didn't have anything sort of to do with things like that. And I really wasn't sort of thing, but as I did the thing, I found just sitting when these bowls were being played or sounds were coming out of them, it just opened something within my spirit, and it began to touch into something in my spirit. So someone gave me one, and I was blessed by them giving it to me. I didn't have a clue what to do with it, but as I've been just engaging with it, I felt the intention, I think, can release through the frequency something that God uses, you know. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways of playing it, but you know, when I learned to do it, it was like, you know, you can sort of make a bong, and you can just create a sound just by rimming the thing, or actually you can go around the side of it and create sounds that just keep the thing going, and then the frequency increases. You know, just now, what does that do? Well, I don't know exactly. I know it's something about intention, and I think it's something about the actual resonant frequency that's produced and how it's used. And there are different crystal bowls with different frequencies. That one's a C, but you can get all the other keys as well. When someone begins to play it or make the sounds, then people engage with it in different ways, you know. And I think our gateways respond to frequencies. So, you know, in the new age thing, they'd be talking about chakras, you know, and you know, the crown chakra and the third eye chakra and the heart chakra and the, you know, core chakras and all these different, I think there's sort of 7 of them that they use. Well, interestingly, we do have 7 soul gates, you know, which are supposed to obviously flow from the inside out. And so some frequencies can activate things within our soul. And I think, do I think there's anything wrong in that? Depends on the intention of the person who's doing it. And that can be good or not necessarily good. Who knows? You know, but from a Christian perspective, you know, a lot of what the enemy is counterfeited essentially is something that God created. You know, the enemy counterfeits the use of sound and frequency that God created for good. You know, so a lot of things around that are opening up, you know. Now, ultimately, it's an expression of us engaging with God himself, who's spirit, who's life, who's energy, who is a frequency. We're engaging with his love. You know, I think there's a lot that's been talked about in terms of solfeggio scales and all that stuff, which I'm not totally convinced about. You know, retuning instruments. We've retuned our instruments here to 4-3-2, I think, where there used to be 440 or 440, 444. And that did change the way in which the sound came from the musicians. Just I picked it up in the spirit. It was much more peaceful, much more harmonious in a way. And they just retuned their instruments. You obviously get people releasing music written in a particular frequency, you know, 5-8, you know, but the actual solfeggio scales where they're saying, well, this is the sort of like, these are the keys that were secret to David and things like that, I'm not totally convinced about, because, you know, real sort of musicians who know what they're on about say that they're all intervals between them aren't actually as have been said. So the intent behind something is more about, rather than the I guess in faith, when you engage something by faith and the person who is engaging it releases faith through it, then I think that can be effective to bring healing, to bring peace, to bring change, transformation, all sorts of different things, you know, revelation that comes through, you know, things being opened as a result of us engaging, gateways that open, let's say, are all part of that. You know, you have obviously fragrant oils and essential oils, and they are supposedly carry a high frequency that effectively brings wholeness or balance when people take them. I don't know enough about any of it to say that it is a particular frequency. I think a lot gets bandied around that may not really be based in science, but it doesn't mean that actually things don't work. They do, but I do think it's the intention also of the person who engages in something in faith that also plays a big part with anything, because God always rewards those who come to him by faith. So if I'm engaging a fragrant oil or something by faith, it can be positive. If I don't engage it by faith, it's just a smell. Some of it does come down to our intentional engagement with things like frequency and fragrances and things like that. And it's certainly not something that I would be have been particularly interested in, because I live in health. But when I heard the guys playing drums and using these crystal bowls and making the sounds and the frequencies, it certainly opened up my senses. I mean, it opened up my spiritual senses. If they felt open, it felt like I was connecting to the frequency that's in everything. There is something vibrating at the heart of everything. God described it to me as his grace, his divine enabling power, which holds everything together, the voice of his power. It is vibrating in everything. God is in and through and above everything, according to Ephesians 4:6. So I think we can connect up with frequency, that vibration in things, and we can make that connection to them and with it. I just wouldn't want to formalize it in any way, because I do also feel it is a lot, because I heard people playing around with the musical bowl things and the crystal bowls, and it didn't do anything. But those who knew what they were doing, they seemed to be able to, with those frequencies, release something that people could engage in and experience and have a positive experience with that. For some people, it really gets into their head. I've been messing around playing with it in my office, and people outside have been like, well, what's that noise? It's really loud. And it's like, I'm in the office and it isn't loud to me, but to them, something is actually quite sharp that pokes into something, which may be a challenge to them, and in an area. So, some people might find, wow, that's getting into my head. Well, probably is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to actually begin to maybe shake some things, maybe resonate with some things. Resonance, I remember that sort of bridge, in Tacoma that, you can see on YouTube, there's this clip of the bridge is swaying in the wind, and then the frequency of the wind, or the vibration of the wind, begins to align with the actual frequency that's vibrating in the bridge, and the whole thing just absolutely starts waving around and collapses and smashes up completely, which is what happens when you get sort of two waves begin to come together. It can create a quite powerful effect. And I think sometimes frequencies can create a powerful effect in that they begin to disrupt and break open. And some things do the opposite. They actually begin to come into more of a harmonic thing and harmony type thing, and it begins to do something positive. Whether it be releasing healing or bringing peace. I think there's so much in these areas which I wouldn't want to try and get sort of all pseudoscience on it and try and invent some things which aren't necessarily there and make it sound that, hey, this is all sort of scientific. It really doesn't matter whether it's scientific or not. It just matters whether we engage God in it and we're flowing in God with it and using some things that God might have placed within creation. You know, he created crystal in the first place, and sound and everything else. But it's quite interesting.
Mike, when we talk about praise or frequency and that, whatever you want to say, as a general rule of thumb, though, really what we want to do is we want to come in, and we want others to come into corporately a place of spiritual rest, so they can really worship God in spirit. Because unless you can come into spiritual rest, I'm going to be in my soul, bouncing around, trying to think what I need to do, and I'm not going to get there without coming into spiritual rest.
Yeah, and rest.
I kind of.
Yeah, I mean, rest in itself is obviously not inactivity. It's a mindset. I'm coming out of a place where I'm totally resting in trusting in God. He's my dad. He's my provider. He's my protector. I trust him. So I'm seeking first the kingdom and his righteousness, and everything else I can be in rest about, because I'm flowing out of my trust in relationship. And so I can dance around and jig around and be in total rest. I could be laying on the floor in total rest. It's nothing to do with necessarily the physical outward manifestation of what my body's doing, but much more to do with that my spirit is in joining with God, and in being in one spirit with him, is in that place of harmony that I am resonating with his life. I carry the very nature that I'm joined with God, and that means I'm flowing from that place. I'm not trying to attain something, I'm flowing from. So if my expression of, say, praise and dance is coming from that place of rest and intimacy with God, and it's just an outworking flowing through my body, that's great. If I am trying to drum something up and trying to get myself into hey, if I dance, then God will give me this because I'm just abandoning myself to him by dancing, then the whole motive of it is selfish. Rest cannot ever be selfish, because God's love is not selfish, it's otherly. It's always to do with outside of my own personal needs and everything else. So rest, everything can flow from that place where I am in union with God. I'm in relationship. I am united with him. I'm one with him. All those expressions, wholeness is an expression of what it's like to be in rest. I'm not striving for anything. I'm not trying to get something by what I'm doing. I'm not flowing out of the DIY, I'm doing this and then I'll earn something, or I'll deserve something, or I'll get a reward or something. It comes out of pure relationship. I'm in him, he's in me, and I am totally at peace and in that relationship. Because in that relationship, I am trusting in him as my dad, as my creator, as the one who thought about me and brought me into existence. I'm just trusting in the flow of that relationship.
And the fruit of that is that, like where you started was, for example, if I need healing, when I come into rest, I've left the need of healing behind, and I'm looking at the healer.
Yeah.
And that's where you kind of know and people know when they've entered that place, I think, of rest.
Oh, totally, yeah. And I think Paul was able to describe it as, I am content when I have everything, and I'm content when I've got nothing. Because it was nothing to do with actual physical circumstances. Because he knew God loved him, and he knew God's blessing on him when he had nothing physically, as well as when he had everything physically. The physical circumstances of his life didn't actually change how he felt about himself and how he felt about God and how he knew God felt about him. It was not in any way conditioned by his own circumstances. And I think when we get to that place where we are at rest in our relationship with God, irrespective of what's going on around us, we can then begin to see things around us aligned out of the will and purpose and heart of God for our lives, because we're not trying to get him to do something for us because we're afraid or we're fearing lack or any of the other things that emotionally might be going on. So we're not trying to get him to do something, and we don't see any of those circumstances as being a reflection of God's love towards us, because they are not, and sometimes obviously God wants us to learn to be like him. Now God is not frantic about the situations in the world. The eclipse that's going to come over the US, is it today, is not going to create judgment on the US, or anywhere else. All that sort of stuff is for people who aren't living in rest. They're looking for a sign, or they're looking for something, always looking for something to either bring them into peace or explain what's going on. It's like, when you live in rest, you live in the eye of the storm. That's how I like to see it. Doesn't mean that there aren't storms raging. It just means we live in the eye of it. It's like Jesus being in the boat, going over to the other side of the lake when there was a huge storm and he was asleep. The disciples were, well, don't you care about us? We're going to drown. And Jesus was just like, no, I said we're going on the other side. He was asleep in the boat. So he was at rest in the midst of something else which caused turmoil for others, because he knew that he was in relationship with the Father, and he knew he was going to outwork the Father's will. So he was able to be at total peace and rest within it. People find that really difficult, because they find it like Peter, when Jesus said, well, come and step out onto the water. And he did. And then what did he do? He took his eyes off Jesus and started to look at the waves and the wind blowing. In other words, it was a bit of a storm. So he started to look at the storm rather than to look at the one who could calm the storm or protect him in the storm. Jesus invited him out to walk on the waters in the storm. It wasn't like it was calm, but he took his eyes off, and therefore he wasn't in rest. If he kept his eyes on Jesus, he could have been at rest in the midst of the storm, even though he was standing on the sea. So it's all to do with who am I in reference to, who am I in relationship with, and when I'm in that intimacy with God, then rest is just a consequence of that. I don't have to try and enter rest. I don't have to create rest. I don't have to do anything. Rest is actually just the result of my relationship with God in intimacy. It's a byproduct of that relationship. People strive to try and enter that rest, and therefore they're trying to make the byproduct, which you can't do. A byproduct is the result of something else, and rest is a result of my knowing who I am in God. That's where the rest comes from. It isn't something I can try and stimulate, create, make, deserve, earn, do anything for. It is a consequence of me knowing my identity as a son of God in relationship with the Father. That's the byproduct of rest.
Why does Paul say strive earnestly to enter? Right.
Well, I think you have to look at what the words were trying to say and what the context he was looking at. What it's saying is, if you don't pursue relationship with God, because that's where the rest comes from. The entering in comes from the relationship. So rest is something I live in when I'm in the relationship, and we need to pursue the relationship. You don't have a relationship without pursuing it. If you don't spend any time with anyone, you don't relate to them. I need to see that I can be relating to God all the time and be focused on that relationship. So I think, you know, there was, you know, like the children of Israel couldn't enter rest because of their unbelief. So unbelief is a rest killer. You know, when you are in a relationship, then that creates rest, and it flows out of it, you know. But the relationship is definitely something to pursue, you know, and to enter into the relationship or live in the relationship is effectively how we enter into rest. Because it's like the relationship produces the rest that we enter into. We need to pursue the relationship. I think that's really the intent of what that verse is. But there are all sorts of different understandings to rest. You know, there's the rest, you know, the Sabbath rest, which is God rested and he's never started working again, has he? You know, he didn't write, oh, well, I've done my rest on the 7th day and now the 8th day I'm going to start working again. You know, and the 8th day is a continuation of living in the 7th day. It's an outworking of the 7th day. So I think there's different contexts to rest. You know, there's physical rest. So make sure we're not physically overtired by burning the candle at both ends, you know, because we need to make sure we have enough physical rest for our body. You know, that's rest. You know, so there's all sorts of different ways of looking at rest. You know, there's the rest of salvation. You know, I am resting in what Jesus has done. In other words, what it means is I am trusting in what Jesus has done and I'm not going to try and help him out. You know, that's a form of rest, because it's trust. You know, so there's lots of different sort of connotations, and there may well be some different biblical words that carry with it a slightly different connotation. So the one there, strive to enter into, you need to look at the context of the verses around it and look at, okay, what was the word that meant rest in that context, and then look at then how that fits into the overall pattern of where Jesus talks about rest or God talks about rest, so that you see that, you know, there would potentially be a pattern that you see throughout Scripture that you can begin to realize what it's talking about. You know, but I know that in my own relationship with God, I feel that I live in rest. It's not that things aren't easy all the time, but when they're not, there's no fear created, you know, because you're resting in the character and nature of God, and you're resting in the fruit of the Spirit, and you're resting in the love of God, in all those things. You know, they all flow out of relationship. You know, and without knowing him, I don't know any of those things. You know, they're not something that I can live from if I don't know them. And knowing them is not a theoretical, well, I'm going to do a study on rest and then I'll be able to enter rest. You know, because rest is just, as I said, the byproduct of the relationship. What I need to do is pursue the relationship, and rest will just be the absolute natural consequence of it. So, yeah. Anything else?
I think in all of this, we have this incredible thing called the power of choice.
Yeah.
And in engaging God, I slowly realized that I have a choice of nearly everything. Even to avoid negative emotions, I actually have a choice. You know.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And in a sense, we have a choice gate. We have a sense of choice, an area where we can choose. And yeah, we've been given free will to choose. How we align those choices will determine the outcomes that we have in our life. And if our choices are aligned with worship, in other words, obedience, in agreement, coming into agreement with God and choosing to accept and go with that agreement. If God is saying something to us, I have a choice whether I ignore it or accept it. And choice brings results, positive or negative, depending on what we've agreed to. And so when we choose out of relationship, we're choosing to, out of that flow of being one with him, of being in union, of being in unison, unified, all those words of being one, then being one with him, that produces everything we need in our lives. If I choose to follow the DIY path, and I'm then having to do things my own self, my own strength, and with the sweat of my brow or with my effort, and everything is then how much a force I can put to it, or how much I can, willpower I can put behind it, and how much I can push that intention, because I'm trying to make something happen, rather than living in the relationship with God where provision, protection, everything flows from the relationship. That's what being in relationship with him releases, because I'm in his name. I am in relationship with his covenant names. So, he is my sanctification. He's my righteousness. If I try to be righteous, and I can even make choices to try and make myself be righteous and try and make righteousness by doing the right thing, then I'm not. It's not doing the right thing, it's being the right thing. My righteousness is my relationship, being in the right relationship with him, that he has made me that way. If I try and make it myself, then the results are very different. So I think our choice, for me, I want to surrender my choice to his. Every day I surrender my free will. I just want your will, and I think that was what Jesus did. Only did what he saw the Father doing. His food was to do the will of his Father. Everything about his life, the whole intention of his life, was done in relationship with the Father. And that produced a life that was able to manifest heaven on earth and flow from the relationship with the Father. And, when you read it, it's like Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing. And then, in another verse, the Father did his works through him, in John 14. So it's like, well, who was doing it? I don't think you need to know. That's the whole point. When you're one, it's like, I'm one spirit. I'm joined to the Lord, and I'm one spirit with him. Well, who is it? My spirit? Is it his spirit? What does it matter? It's spirit, and I think that's what it becomes like when you get to that place where you're in such a relationship that I only want to do that flows out of that relationship. So, I give, if God says you can choose, I'm just saying I only want to choose you. That's the best choice. I'm going to choose you, and then everything will be flowing out of that, and I do sometimes consciously just say, I totally surrender my free will. I'm not interested in doing anything independently of you. You've given me the right to do it, but I don't want it. I just want to do things out of my relationship with you, because then everything will flow from that, which is, a wonderful place to be, living in that place of rest in the midst of life. Just people can feel it. People can feel around you that you are at peace when others may be frantic, and then you can be a peacemaker, and you can create an atmosphere of peace, an atmosphere of joy, an atmosphere of love in which when people come to you, that's what they will begin to experience. So, yeah.
So, Mike, do you live your life in a conscious state of surrender? Like living sacrifice is surrender.
Yeah.
So are you consciously all the time in surrender?
Yeah, totally.
So you're not making a choice. The choice comes up, and you're surrendering that choice to him each time.
Yeah, and just flowing. Yeah, because when it comes to it, it's like, I don't want to go and be a living sacrifice in the morning and then not be a living sacrifice from the rest of the day. I don't want to get up off the altar. So I continually live from the altar. It's like, I am there. My life is a living sacrifice. I've laid it down and I don't pick it back up again. But that doesn't mean that I'm inactive. It just means that I'm surrendered, me doing it my way. You know, I'm not going to do it my way. You know, I'm not going to do it the way I think. I'm not going to do it the way that my soul might want to do it independently. I am surrendered. I am a living sacrifice. Therefore, my life is to be lived in relationship with God in a surrendered state of, I only want to do what I see the Father doing. I only want to flow out of that relationship. Now, you know, I'm not perfect. So times that I wouldn't be like that way, but generally that's my desire. It's my intention. I choose that. And then I look to flow out of that. So by and large, that's how I live. You know, sometimes things try to disrupt that. Then I've got to make sure that I'm centered in that place, that I don't get up off the altar and try and, you know, fight back against someone, or, you know, operate in anger or operate out of the wrong motive on the heart. Because I've basically, you know, I'm co-crucified with Christ, so I no longer live. But the life I do live, I live by faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave his life for me. So I am not living for myself, but I want to live with him and live from that place. So it's his faith that I'm living by, not mine. I'm just living with him in relationship. And I think that if we live from that place, then we live, that's what rest is for me. Living from that place of intimacy, flowing out of that place, making choices which are aligned with that place of being in him, and just being me, who he made me to be in relationship. You know, none of us were ever designed to be separated from him. So our world consciousness was never designed to be independent of God consciousness. That's why the spirit was outside of the body. So the first barrier, the first connect with the world was not someone's physical eyes, physical touch. It was the spirit. So the spirit had already interpreted the situation in relationship with God before the eyes, ears, and everything else ever got to engage anything. So it was always filtered through, here's a heavenly perspective, here's a godly perspective, rather than what happens now is most people have an experience, they see something happens, it's filtered through the soul, which creates all sorts of negativity usually, and then the spirit has to try and calm it all down and bring back rest. Whereas if the spirit engages everything first, the soul doesn't even get a chance of reacting to physical things in a way of fear or anxiety or worry or anxiousness in any way, because the spirit is the first thing that will engage life, which is why I extend my spiritual boundaries to engage the life around me. You know, I'm not waiting for stuff to come to me. You know, I'm looking to engage the world and be able to perceive the world through spiritual senses first, rather than physical ones.
So one last thing.
Yeah.
So communion is as simple as coming in one with him, spiritual sacrifice, so that when I'm one with him, I can be surrendered to him as one with him.
Yeah. It's a really simple. I find everything's really simple when you just get down to the basics. We overcomplicate it by trying to, put formulas around it or make it so that everyone has to do this or do that or do the other. I present myself as a living sacrifice. That's my attitude of life. It's not something I just go and do. It's the way my whole life is lived as a living sacrifice. So I don't have to go through a formula. No, when I was learning about it, it was useful to know what the sacrifice was. The head chopped off and being the mind thinking, the legs chopped off being the way I walk it out, my inward parts opened up, my skin removed, all the surface layers. I mean, that was just a helpful analogy of me living from that place of sacrifice, that my mind is surrendered, my heart is surrendered, my motives are surrendered, everything is surrendered. So it's a living sacrifice. I don't want to do anything for myself. So I'm laying myself down in terms of for the relationship. And then everything flows out of the relationship. And we don't have to jump through hoops to have that relationship. He's already done everything needed for us to enter into that relationship. He's already reconciled us to himself. He's already not counting anything against us. He's already desiring to restore everything. So I just have to accept and enter into it. You don't have to do anything other than enter into what he's already done, by giving up doing it your own way. That's the way. It's like, if we're honest, doing it our own way hadn't really got us too far. We've not got a good track history generally of being successful, and we do things in our own strength, in our own way, which is what Jesus said. All who are weary and heavy laden, come to me and find rest. Learn from me, because I'm gentle and humble in heart. That's the key. Knowing who I am in him is the key to everything else. If I don't know who I am in him, then I am going to have to try and find that out or discover it, or usually by doing stuff, rather than by being. So if I know who I am, I'm at rest. If I'm trying to discover who I am, then I'm looking to do something that will enable me to discover it. And I don't think that really works too well. So being a living sacrifice, it's a total attitude of heart, that then as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So as you begin to live from that place, then you live from that place, and it outflows. So that attitude is one which for me is the way I just think. I think that way now, but I had to learn how to do that. I mean, it took me time to get to the point of surrender and to outwork. And it's an outworking of my relationship with God, and desire. I have a desire for more. So whatever, I want more in that relationship, in the sense of knowing God more. I mean, it's just, I can't get more of God, but I can know him more as he unveils himself in that sense, and reveals himself, in deeper, calling to deep, and that whole sort of going deeper and deeper into a relationship with him. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay.